I'd like to introduce our next panel discussion this morning, and you've heard from me frequently about investment tax credits and how important investment tax credits are for tradespeople across the country, and how businesses and companies, in order to receive that maximum investment tax credit, 30 or 40%, depending on what your technology is that you have to comply with prevailing wage definition, which is our union collective agreements, full package, and a mandatory minimum apprenticeship requirement. And so we know how good this is for workers, and we know how good this is going to be for our members right across the country. But it is also really good for industry. And if you saw my presentation yesterday listing conservatively over $100 billion worth of projects that are waiting for this investment tax credit legislation to pass, there's businesses waiting for it to pass so they can make those investments and start those projects and get those projects underway. So we thought it was really important for us to have some industry representatives here today from across the country to talk about the investment tax credits and to talk about their projects and how important this government bill, this government policy is not only to us, but to the economic future of Canada. So it's my pleasure to invite our panelists to the stage at this time. So we have James Skoniak, Executive Vice President, Operational Service and Chief Development Officer, Bruce Power. Kendall Dilling, President of Pathways Alliance in Alberta. Scott Penny is the CEO of the Port of Argentia in Newfoundland and Labrador. And our panel is going to be moderated by Podrigan Murphy, a lawyer from Koski and Minsky, who helped CBTU in drafting the legislation. Please, a round of applause for our panelists.
Okay. All right, up and running. So we are here to talk about the green investment tax credits, which have labor requirements attached to them, which Sean was just describing. By way of introduction, I'd just say that this is really exciting because it's the first time we've seen this type of measure with a federal income tax credit in Canada. So I'd like to begin by just asking each of you to tell us a bit about what kinds of projects, and by extension jobs, industry has forecasted for these in connection with these measures.
Yes,
We'll get you to start, James.
Yeah, happy to start. Can you hear me okay? So the first thing I do just before I answer the question, I do want to thank Sean Strickland and the entire Canadian building trades for your support and your work with the Government of Canada on these investment tax credits. As an industry representative, I can tell you we wouldn't be where we are today without the support of the building trade unions across Canada. The other thing I want to say before I talk about the work that this is enabling is there's a really important word in the theme of this conference, and that's safety. And one of the things, I always make a rule with for myself as a leader within Bruce Power, that before I talk about money, I always talk about safety. We have thousands of construction workers that are working on our site right now to life extend our 8 reactors on site. It's the most powerful energy source in the world, nuclear power. It's a great energy source. It's clean, it's reliable. It's a source of medical isotopes, but it's a powerful energy source. And so the investment tax credits are really providing an opportunity for our organization to really offset some of the impacts of inflation and the Inflation Reduction Act in the US. But the most important thing for us as we embark on all of these construction and infrastructure projects is to remember that every single day we're putting our workers in harm's way. And what stability from an organizational and industry perspective means is that we can plan long term. So it's about getting the work done, but by planning the work long term, we can make sure that workers have the training that they need so they can go to work safe, but also have the certainty that they're going to be in a career that they can invest in, and we can spend the the time, the money, and the resources and training. The facility, the program we have underway at Bruce Power is the largest operating nuclear facility in the world, and it will be for decades to come. So we'll talk more about the specifics of ITCs, but fundamentally, these ITCs enable that. But what's also important about the ITCs as it relates to Bruce Power is the company doesn't get any of the benefit of the ITCs. 100% of the ITC benefit flows to the ratepayers of Ontario. So it helps us keep our project costs low, and by keeping project costs low and competitive, that flows 100% to electricity ratepayers in Ontario.
Good morning. I guess for me as the CEO at the Port of Argentia, ITCs have, I guess, created some stability go forward. We have tremendous opportunities in which we're leading, I believe, in the country. We currently have our Trades NL workforce completing the West White Rose for Cenovus Energy. We have the potential to be a spool base for Equinor's Beta Nord project. We are the first monopile marshalling port in North America for the U.S. offshore wind market. And as well, we have an equity stake in what the project is called Argentia Renewables, which is being developed by Pattern Energy, which is owned by the Canadian Pension Fund. So as you can see, we're leading that transition. We've got our hands in every single industry, and we're going hand in hand right along with, organizations like Trades NL to have this built. What ITCs will do, it will give stability at the FID stage. And that is so critical for us as a port because it'll just create spin-offs that we would not even be able to comprehend. And one other piece that I forgot to mention is we are building a dock extension to facilitate and support the demand. And so when we talk about investment funding, very quickly, about a year ago, we received just under $40 million through the National Trade Corridor Fund to support that dock infrastructure. And as well, we just received $15 million more from the provincial government to support that energy transition. And that's what this new dock is going to do. So ITCs, government support, the trades workforce is a critical element to all of this, especially for the Port of Argentia.
Good morning, everyone. Absolute pleasure to be here again. Always good, I think, to have industry and labor talking and coordinating and planning and strategizing, and in this case, maybe a little bit of praying and candle lighting that we can actually execute all the work that's in front of us with the people we have. Yeah, so I'll try we've got a nice pan-Canadian panel here, and I'll try and bring a little bit of the Western/Albertan perspective. And there's certainly lots of work ahead of us, and as Minister Sani indicated, labor constraints, actual human resources are probably going to be our limiting factor in how much work we can execute in the coming years. There's obviously a big focus on getting stuff done by 2030, and we're going to talk about the ITCs, and that's one of the challenges is that it's forcing a whole bunch of industrial activity through this little knothole called 2030, because after that the ITC drops in half in terms of how much you qualify for. So there's good and bad to that. It's good in that it's going to drive a lot of emission reducing activities, a lot of green technology implementation in a short period of time, and that's obviously awesome. But if we had our druthers as industry, we would much rather do it in a little more sustained, sequenced way so that we were, not taxing labor and supply chain beyond what's reasonable. But alas, here we are, and so we're all going to give it a good try. Our project, as one example, and this is just one project of many CCS projects in Western Canada, and only one of many, many projects across Canada that will be using the ITCs. Our project alone will create about 130,000 person years of work. So that's 30 to 40,000 workers per year over a 5 or 6 year construction window. So, and that's just one project, right? And there's multiple other projects going on in the carbon capture and storage space, and we've got petrochemical expansions going on in the province. We've of course got, for the first time in a hard-fought decade, we finally got some oil moving off the West Coast to international markets, and within a year we should have some LNG, methane molecules moving off the West Coast to international markets. These are all things that are portend, a really strong future. So on top of all this one-time decarbonization activity, you're going to have just, a more robust base business across oil and gas and many other sectors as we, provide these resources that the world desperately needs. And we're going to provide them in a low-carbon, responsibly produced way. And, we think over time that the demand and market for this will require these products to be low carbon, which is why projects like ours are so critical.
Awesome, thanks. Sorry. Scott, I'd like to ask you just a bit more about, I guess, the human impact. What do the ITCs mean for investors and shareholders and local community members?
Well, I think what it gives is it gives stability. So if I'm an organization like Trades NL, if you take that example at our port, right now there's upwards of 500 plus tradespeople building a concrete gravity structure. And within the next, hopefully, with the ITCs, et cetera, we'll be building a wind farm. And who better to build that wind farm than our tradespeople? So same with a spool base. So those types of things give stability to industries and associations like Trades NL that give stability to their workforce. Investors, obviously, they want a return on their money, and ITCs allow for that return to come obviously much quicker. Then you talk about community. And the Port of Argentia was an old U.S. naval base. They left in 1995, left to the community. It slugged its way through for the last 25 years. COVID brought new life to it, to be quite honest with you. And we were able to, tap into an area, an industry, and bring industry sectors to Newfoundland that had not been there before. And so what we're looking to do with that, tax credit is we need to give it back to our community. So for the last 10 plus years, there's been an agreement between the port and the town of Placentia, which back in the 60s, there were about 65 to 70,000 people living there. Now there's less than 5,000. What this will do for community, we will be giving, and we have an agreement to give 20% of gross revenues directly to the town. That is huge, projected to be somewhere in the range of greater than $5 million by 2030. And that is quite significant for a small town of 5,000 people. And that's not a carrot to try to get them to agree to put wind turbines and, a spool base. Argentia is a brownfield site. It's an old U.S. naval base. And this is really about trying to, I don't know what the color is between green and brown, but that's essentially what we're trying to do. And so it has a major impact on community. It'll have a major impact on development, socioeconomic improvements, healthcare. So it is quite significant.
Anybody else on that? Okay. Kendall, I'd like to ask you, when we think about scenarios that are penciled in but are still waiting for that last sort of signature, for that certainty, what do the ITCs mean for those kinds of situations? Are they bringing a kind of investment or regulatory certainty with them?
Yeah, so the ITCs are incredibly important. As I'm sure you all probably know, they are literally making their way through the very, very final stages of the legislative process as we speak. And it's, taken probably longer than any of us would have hoped for, but nonetheless, I think we're at the finish line, touch wood. They are critical, right? Like, they're, for most projects, and every project is unique and has its own economics, but most projects, the ITC is the most significant building block of an overall fiscal framework that is going to allow these projects to FID and proceed. And a lot of the other supports are contingent upon that piece being there. It in and of itself is not equivalent to the US Inflation Reduction Act. Sadly, I don't think there's a country in the world that has a $1 trillion war chest to just open up to deploy. And so that's it's a reality that we're all facing in terms of how do we compete with that. But the ITC is a really critical part. Where the ITC doesn't really help is on operating costs, and I think maybe some of our other panelists will touch on that as well, but it's great in terms of that upfront construction cost, but a lot of these projects are also very expensive to operate over the course of many, many years, and in the US, you get that guaranteed support for at least 10 years of operation, and that's where there's still a bit of a delta, and that's where you get into conversations around contracts for difference and other instruments, but all of those are contingent upon the ITC as the building block.
Okay, that does lead into the next question, sort of exactly, which was that one of the differences between our ITCs and the ones in the US that they are modeled after is that ours are capital investment only. So we don't have anything for ongoing operation or output. And James, I was hoping you could talk a bit about whether, is that a missed opportunity? And if so, why has the government done it this way?
Yeah, so it's a good question, and it really depends how you look at it. And I'll obviously answer it from an electricity-centric perspective. If you look at what the government in the U.S. did, it was really in response to what I call dysfunctional electricity markets. Right? You have deregulated markets in most of the states in the U.S., so it's really a drive to the lowest possible price. So you have a lot of existing assets that actually don't need capital investment, but the government wants to keep them open. So in that particular case, a production tax credit makes sense. If you have a nuclear plant, it doesn't need a lot of capital, but it can run for the next 10 years, but a market price is pushing it down. Production tax credit makes sense, right? Because you provide a tax credit to keep that plant running. What I like about the investment tax credits that the building trades were so instrumental in helping advance here in Ottawa is that I think it does both to some degree. So number one, in Canada, we don't have deregulated markets aside from Alberta. Ontario is a contractual model. Rest of the provinces in Canada are crown corporation with electricity. So in my view, investment tax credits, what they do is they incentivize the investment. And I don't like and I just use the word, but in the case of electricity, the federal government has been clear that all of the investment tax credits that go to electricity producers have to flow to the ratepayer. So I think what the federal government has done is correct, which is you want to enable the investment. But keep in mind, let me just play out an example here. If Bruce Power this year will spend $2 billion in capital on our life extension, that will all be eligible for an ITC, 15%. So do the quick math, that's $300 million. That $300 million, instead of us getting paid a power price for $2 billion of investment, we will get paid a power price for, minus 300 that, 1.7. So the ratepayer gets a lower cost, and that's what we need in a world of affordability, right? We know working families are struggling with paying their bills. I actually don't like calling it an investment tax credit. I want to call it a ratepayer tax credit, because that's fundamentally what it is. So I think the government, when it came to electricity, got it right. I'll just tell you the two concerns I have that I think we all need to work together on. The first is that you talked about this very eloquently, which is certainty is everything. We have a minority government here in Ottawa right now, and our investment program runs out 20 years. I can't tell you who's going to win the next election. I'll leave that to smarter people than me, but I can guarantee you in the next 50 years of Bruce Power's investments, there's going to be multiple governments. We need political stability to know whoever is in power in Ottawa supports keeping these. Whether that's a re-elected Liberal government, a new Democrat government, or a Conservative government. And to me, I think you've done amazing work getting these ITCs there. They're going to get these over the finish line. There's some wording we'll have to work through, and I know we can always reach to the building trades to get that wording right. The next battle is making sure this is a nonpartisan issue. because the only thing worse than not having an ITC is advancing a project thinking you have an ITC, and then a new government comes in and cancels an ITC. And that's what we have to work together on. So we've done the work to get there. And I sometimes feel for governments because, sometimes we're like the dog that caught the car. I'm from Bruce County, and that's a term we use. And sometimes we need to say thank you. And has it been too slow? Absolutely. And I'm sure if you had Minister O'Regan up here, he'd agree with you. They're gonna get it done. I have no doubt. And if not, I know you guys will be on the phone to the Prime Minister. Our next battle is re-elected Liberal government, a new Democrat government, a Conservative government. How do we make sure that this is something all parties agree on? And I would be very cautious about when we talk about this from a benefits perspective, making it too much about the investors. Ultimately, this benefits customers. If your investor gets a benefit from it, ultimately that flows down to the customer. Because if you didn't have the ITC, you'd put it in the price of whatever you're charging the customer for. So I think one of the narrative issues, especially in an area of affordability, is talking about the ITCs. Obviously, it puts people to work, it gets infrastructure built. But Canadians are only okay with that as long as they still have affordability in their lives. And so we just need to think about that. So I can't criticize the government in Ottawa on this. I can, but it'd be unfair because, nothing's perfect. But the US model is designed because of a dysfunctional electricity market. And we shouldn't model something in Canada to fix something that's dysfunctional somewhere else.
Could I just,
Yeah, for
could I just add one thing, because you're right. Stability is key, and I witnessed that last week. Last week I was in New Orleans attending the International Partners Forum, which is the U.S. offshore wind development market. So you've got all the major players there, Equinor, Ørsted, RWE, Vineyard Wind. And I mean, there's a tremendous investment going into the United States right now around offshore wind. So the big question there at every single booth, at every single reception, at every single meal, at every single cocktail hour is, what do we do if the president changes next election? What happens? So me as the Canadian would listen, and if it does change, then I think we as Canadians and as a buildings trade, we need to be ready, because I think I'll make a prediction that I think what you will see a significant shift out of U.S. waters coming towards Canada to do floating offshore or offshore wind and invest in Canadian industry. And that's where we need to be ready, because we're just south. Like, they can just come around the corner, and they're in hopefully a very friendly, industrialized opportunity for them to make investment, and therefore create more opportunity to decarbonize our country. So there's a tremendous opportunity. But it all goes back to stability, and I can tell you that's what we certainly need. That's what all of you in this room need, is stability.
Okay. So my next question really takes it back to sort of labor itself. When the ITCs were first announced, it wasn't entirely clear what the prevailing wage was going to be. Now we know the prevailing wage is going to be based on the collective agreement with the CBTU affiliate that either applies to the work or would apply to the work. Now that we have that information, that labor costs are a known quantity, does that open up more opportunities in connection with the work?
So I'll answer it from our perspective in electricity. To be honest, I really didn't care what the requirements were, because we far exceed them. We only build with unionized labor, period, full stop. I think it's a competitive advantage. I do. And I think if the people of Canada are going to invest, I think we should demand the best. So I don't have an issue with it. I really believe the components around apprenticeships are important. I think we need to make sure that if we're building long-term infrastructure, we're building a long-term workforce. I think there's a lot more that we can do as industry. I sometimes think we're behind in a number of areas. So the short answer is no issue there. And maybe I can go back to politics, if that's okay. Well, you're not going to say no, but this is a political conference, and it should be, because public policy is driven by that, is building trades in Canada, whether it's at the provincial level or the national level, are the difference between being in government and not being in government. Like, I believe that. And you can talk to pollsters, but I believe that. And so I think not only here do we have something that building trades have been successful at advocating for, but I think the building trades are a power force in driving public policy. And I think you can do that across all three parties, and we shouldn't be ashamed to say we're going to build with union labor and we're going to build the workforce of the future, and that's the end of the discussion.
Kendall, I don't bring you in on the critical side. What are some of the challenges with the ITCs as they're currently drafted?
Yeah, and so you can get very technical here, and I don't want to do that today. There's really only one thing that matters, and this is a very influential room of people, so any chance you have to whisper this in somebody's ear, please do on behalf of industry. To extend this beyond 2030 is so critical. And we get the reasons why the 2030 deadline is there. They want to incent industry to move as quickly as we can because of the urgency of the climate imperative and getting these reductions happening. I completely understand that, but the reality is we're sitting here, midway through 2024. In our case, we just submitted regulatory applications. We're advancing our project as fast as we can, but there's all kinds of externalities you can't control. How long does that regulatory approval take? Our track record in this country on approvals has been pretty slow of late. So, what if that approval takes longer than anticipated? What if? Like, there's all these things that a developer can't control. And so, you don't want to be in this scary situation of having your project half built and at the end of 2030 and worrying if you're going to qualify for the last half of that investment. I'll be honest, I am sure when you talk to any politician about it off the record, they would say, yeah, don't worry, we'll do something in 2028 or 2029 and be reasonable. But the challenge is we have to make long-term investment decisions now. In the case of the Pathways Alliance, we will be, by the end of this year, putting in a multi-billion-dollar pipe order that's irreversible based on the assumption that this is all going to be able to happen by 2030. Well, what if something happens and we can't, and a bunch of that investment falls off the back end? It makes it really hard to FID a project with that uncertainty. So that'd be the one thing we would ask, is if we could have support in getting this extended by a couple years. That would do wonders for industry.
And can I just add just one, and this may sound like an overly practical point, but so right now on our major component replacement project, we're doing the removal series on our second unit. So we have a real cross section of trades out there doing that work every day. One of the things that sometimes goes, we talk sometimes about trades in this kind of abstract piece and skills. The difference between a 12-hour shift being safely done with quality and schedule is sometimes 3 or 4 people on a crew that drive that crew and set the tone and have the experience and have the learning. Like, it's amazing to me. Like, you can look at a 12-hour shift that's successful and a 12-hour shift that's not. And, we can talk about all this policy stuff in the world, but it's that capability within. And I think that one of the things that we also have to recognize is it's not a one-for-one trade when we're talking about workers. I can go down into our valve shop, and there's a gentleman who's been there for 30 years, and he's going to retire. I'm trying to convince him not to, but he's going to retire in 6 months, and we've got a hiring plan to then bring in another mechanic to do his work. That new mechanic that's going to come in and do his work could not, and no disrespect to that person, could not touch what that individual does in a day. So I think when we think about this, we look at salaries, we look at apprenticeships, we have to also think about it from, what are we doing to invest in increasing competency quicker? Because we're looking at these trades issues as if these are one-to-one issues, and they're not. And people who have worked in the field know what I'm talking about, right? It looks, 1 + 1 = 2, you think. Well, when you're doing work in the field, it's not. Depending on who the 1 + 1, and it can equal 8. versus 1 + 1 = 1. You know what I mean? And so I also think we need to help with our policymakers on, and with working with industry of how do we drive some of this quicker? Because the math doesn't always get it done. So.
Okay. My next question comes partly as a pension policy wonk, but Budget 2024 included some new announcements about these tax credits. And in particular, we learned that the clean electricity tax credit is going to be available to non-taxable corporations or tax-exempt corporations. That's unlike the carbon capture and the clean hydrogen credits. And one of the things that means is that pension funds will be more able to take advantage of the clean electricity tax credit because they can invest now through their own subsidiary, fully tax-exempt pension investment corporation. Wondering, any comments on why the government would have made that decision and what impact it's going to have?
Well, if I could just say, like our Newfoundland son Bob Cole would say, when I got word on the ITCs and what it entailed and the opportunity to say, "Oh baby," it is really good for the Port of Argentia, and we're ecstatic with it. I mean, it enables us now to invest in our infrastructure, right? So we can decarbonize our new dock extension. You know, I've been to many places, and you go to Norway, and there's no vessel that comes in that is, you know, black smoke spewing out of its stack. Like, you don't see that. It's, they shut them down, they go on hydrogen, and they come in, and you know, they're silent, and they're very environmentally friendly. So for us, we see that as an opportunity. But what it really done was it gave the opportunity to invest in these projects, make it more motivating, you know, to pension funds, community organizations, to look at ways to contribute to the impact that we're having on the environment and a way to improve it. And that's simply what I see it as. And as I said, you know, when we saw that, our board of directors, our partners at Argentia Capital and Torrent, the government, Pattern Energy, it's huge. And it will create jobs, and it'll create spin-off like you wouldn't believe. And it all spurs investment. So, you know, federal government and provincial drop 55 million, and Pattern comes in, then they invest in the dock, and it just continues to go. And it's just like you're jumping from bank to bank to bank, and makes it very attractive to investors, makes it very attractive to workforce, and then on top of that, you pay the prevailing wages, and everybody wins. It's a great opportunity. We can't let it go.
Okay, I think there's time for just one more quick-ish question. I'm going to go back to the U.S. regime. So in the U.S. regime, there's a much more significant penalty for failing to meet the labor requirements. So for our regime, whatever the tax credit is at the full rate, it's 10% lower if you're not meeting the labor requirements. In the U.S., it can be fivefold. So for their clean electricity, it's 30% is the full, and it drops down to 6% if the labor requirements aren't met. Why do you think we made that decision? I might leave it. James?
I don't know. Look, I think that no, I don't know, to be honest. I mean, I think that obviously there are, and you know, I'm not excusing it. I'm just trying to answer the question as straight as I can. Obviously, there are sectors that have a different composition of their workforce than I'm used to seeing in electricity, right? And so, and I'm not saying that's right or wrong, but sometimes a bird in the hand is better than two in the bush. And so, if advancing some of these things advances, you know, closer to we need to be, that's progress. So that's how I would look at it. You know, and so, you know, the one thing I wouldn't mind just covering, since, you know, nobody really wants to answer this question, I do want to go back to pension funds really quickly. There's a real focus in the budget on Canadian pension funds investing more in Canada, and you know that better than anybody. OMER's pension plan, which represents 600,000 public service employees, is one of our 2 largest investors, along with TC Energy. And whenever people talk about pension investment, I always say, well, look at what OMER's is doing. Look at what they're doing now. And so I think it's good there's tools that encourage pension investment in Canada. But I think we have to be careful about a generic comment about we're going to make pension plans invest more in Canada. Of course we want that, but pension funds are not the government's money. It's workers' money. And many of you have responsibilities as trustees in your own pensions, and you have a responsibility to make sure that money that you are the trustee of is invested and earns a reasonable, secure rate of return for people's future. So I prefer a dynamic where the governments are finding ways that it makes sense for pensions to invest in Canada, and let's get away from the generic discussion, because a pension plan's money for a worker is as much their authority or where to invest it as for a private sector company. And I just think we have to reorient ourselves on that.
I guess what I would just say, and I appreciate this will be my probably last remark, so I'll end on this note. And Sean can attest to this, because we've been talking to CBTU for years now, as our project has been developed, as the ITC has been developed and conceived and now almost legislated. You know, to your question, Protogene, I don't know, you know, why they went with the measures they did in the US versus here on labor. All I know is from day one, our interests have been aligned. And Alberta is not, the oil and gas industry is not an exclusively union industry, but in principle, knowing that all of this ITC investment is ultimately our money, taxpayer money, coming to support industry to make these investments. I mean, it's completely logical and makes sense that you would want to use those funds to maximize local labor involvement, and to pay highest prevailing wage. We have never had a disagreement in principle on that, nor on the apprentice requirements. We are desperate in Alberta to get more young people going into the trades. We are completely aligned in that kind of an objective. And the only thing, Sean, we've ever provided feedback on the ITC is, let's just make sure we don't make this an administrative nightmare that creates a small army of people trying to do the accounting on this thing. Let's just make it simple to understand and implement. Other than that, we are 100% aligned with CBTU.
Great. I think that's it. Thank you so much. And I don't know if it's a break now or.